because diabetes is the ultimate bad thing that can happen. That's the kind of the king of metabolic diseases.
Well, I have the privilege and pleasure today of finally meeting Gabor Erdosi, who is a master's in molecular biology and working in food science industry at the moment, developing processes for new and better foods, hopefully. So great to meet you, Gabor.
Nice to meet you, Ivor.
Absolutely. And we, I think it was late 16, spent 6 months with you mentoring and helping me, and hundreds of scientific papers sending to me all around the incretins and insulin resistance. And that was a really, really valuable period for me, so thank you. And we'll talk a little about it today. So the first thing I'd like to get into, Gabor, is insulin sensitivity and lower insulin. You run the Facebook group Lower Insulin.
Yeah.
And we both share a very strong belief that lower insulin and high insulin sensitivity is a really important route to health and longevity. So perhaps if you could just describe in your own words why insulin sensitivity and achieving lower insulin is so important.
Yeah, I think that the first thing you see common between blue zones, I mean people living beyond 100 years old, centenarians, is that they are still insulin sensitive in their 80s and even sometimes in their 90s. That's the only common thing what you will find in these papers dealing with this. So I think it's extremely important, and possibly in this modern context we have been living in, the single most important thing that you would like to take care of.
Yeah, agreed. And actually the catavans, it springs to mind also, they are defined by their incredibly low insulin and glucose metrics.
Yes.
In spite of eating quite a bit of real food carbohydrate. They're not low carb, but they achieve it. So if you take that as really important, then what would your list of lifestyle and nutrition choices be in order of importance, starting with main ones, to achieve that state?
I think food is a huge one, and but first I would mention stress, and you should eliminate stress, especially chronic stress, from your life as much as possible. And then secondly, fix your sleep, because if you have absolutely screwed up sleep patterns, you won't be able to eliminate stress. And if you have a continuously elevated cortisol level, you cannot fight your body, so you won't be able to do much with your diet. I have some friends, they sleep 3-4 hours early in the morning only, and yeah, they started losing weight after changing their diet, but they stopped and stuck there completely. So sleep is another big one. And then, yeah, coming back to diet, I think the single most important thing is to limit the ultra refined food consumption to the lowest possible. I think, and within the refined food group, refined carbohydrates is the single biggest group of foods what you need to completely eliminate, I think.
Yeah, certainly. So the ultra-refined carbohydrates, and we'll get into more detail on it, in terms of their effect on your body, goes way, way beyond the mere calories they bring. Yeah. What about the fructose factor then? It's contested as to how negative fructose is in driving insulin resistance and dysfunction.
I think this topic is a little bit controversial, because I'm not 100% sure that fructose is specific beyond, not calories, but beyond its effects on I mean, it's digested differently, and then it's processed differently by the intestines and also by the liver. So there are some molecular clues which suggest that perhaps fructose is much different than the other sugars, but some of the epidemiology and some of the experimental evidence is not really there. So you don't find the full line of evidence building from with a bottom-up approach building from mechanistic evidence through experimental evidence, and then to epidemiology. I think sugar-sweetened beverages are definitely bad. Don't drink your calories or your sugar. That's not a good idea. Otherwise, I don't really have a clear-cut opinion on fructose. It's similarly bad as other sugars, I would say. Definitely, at least as bad. If it's any worse, I don't really know.
Right, and I tend to agree that, you know, in people who are eating healthy low-carb diets without refined carbohydrate, problematic foods, then it's arguable that having substantial fructose is not a problem. But maybe in overweight, insulin-resistant people taking a lot of fructose may be quite negative.
Yeah, I think all the fructose in a modern environment is in ultra-refined foods, or the big majority at least. If one and then you eat a piece of fruit, it won't make you sick. That's for sure, because I think most of our ancestors did so.
Yeah.
And I'm not aware that eating some fruits leads to metabolic diseases. So
exactly, and to be honest, that's a good rule of thumb. If you remove the modern highly processed foods, by default you're removing the vegetable oils, the refined carbohydrates, and most of the fructose. So you're getting a huge result just by eliminating those.
Yeah.
So then in terms of, so nutrition, refined carb removal, I mentioned vegetable oils myself. We might just check with you on the vegetable oils. How do you feel?
I think it's context dependent. Adding vegetable oils to the processed carbohydrate-laden foods is a very bad idea. And let's say consuming vegetable oils, purified vegetable oils, is always a bad idea. But consuming some omega-6 rich foods, I mean whole foods, especially in a low-carb context, is not really bad.
I would actually agree as well, because the natural foods, if you eat natural real foods and not processed foods, it's very unlikely you'll get excessive omega-6 really, or get your 3-to-6 ratio going bad. Maybe if you mainline on nuts incredibly, but even then I'm not in a reasonable whole foods diet.
This always reminds me, I mean the nuts, it's not going nuts, but I saw I think short documentary about some monkeys living in a forest, and actually there were two groups of monkeys, and they I think it was a war for the nut-rich area in the forest. So they got rid of all fruits, and they were all in for the nuts and some meat, what they could find in there. So I think nuts probably is okay in that context.
Right, and they bring a lot of minerals and other nutrients, the nuts, magnesium, and many other beneficial things. So very different than eating omega-6 and processed vegetable oils. So we got vegetable oils, refined carb, and fructose, excessive fructose elimination. Stress, certainly, particularly chronic stress with cortisol raising, and sleep patterns, which will also raise cortisol if you have poor sleep, and many other hormones. And they're probably the main things in your environment. If you did all those really correctly, maybe you wouldn't need to be exercising 6 hours a day. You wouldn't need too much else.
Yeah, I don't exercise a lot actually, so I do more during the summer.
I'm joking.
It does, yeah. But I mean, I'm all in for long walks.
Yes.
And do some resistance training once in a while. I don't even do it very regularly, so when I feel like I do. Otherwise, I'm not a everyday exercise guy. So.
Right, but again, long walks, more and more it's transpiring that long brisk walks can be some of the best exercise you can take, especially if you do some press-ups and resistance training occasionally.
So standing up from your desk, I think that's an important thing.
That's a big start for a lot of people.
Every 20-30 minutes or so, that's very important.
Yeah, and walk around a little, and make sure in your work you try and maximize the walking around in your work if possible. So now if we move to getting everyone to do that, some people are at much more risk than others, and one group I'm fascinated by, and David Bobbitt, who I work on behalf of, is fixated too on trying to save these guys. And the guys are the ones who are not obese, they're not overweight, but their insulin resistance and poor metrics are as bad as very obese guys. So although the obese are more likely to be insulin resistant and have issues, there are a lot more of the non-obese. So on average, there's probably as many exposed guys to heart attacks and chronic disease out there who are not obese, and they're probably not being focused on. They appear to be not obese, they don't smoke, but they're the ones with sudden heart attacks. So how do we get to those guys with all of these steps to fix themselves?
Yeah, I think it was the right way how you put it. It's more likely that obese are insulin resistant than lean, but it's actually much more complex than that. So you can be very insulin resistant if you are lean. In fact, one of the most insulin resistant group comes from a disease which is called Lipodystrophy. That is actually, it means that they lack proper amounts of subcutaneous fat, so fat under their skin, right under their skin, and because they cannot store fat in the right place, that is adipose tissues. This fat goes to all the bad places, like all the wrong places, like the livers and other organs, muscles, everywhere, and that's where it causes insulin resistance. So the fat going into the wrong places. That's insulin resistance as I understand it.
Yeah, essentially that's a great definition of it. Yeah. And those people, they can be, as you say, lipodystrophy people are extreme, but also people of Asian extraction tend to have a lower personal fat threshold, and they have an element of that problem that they can't seem to quite readily expand their body fat, and therefore hit a wall where they start getting organ fat.
In fact, lately I have started calling this epidemic what we are living diabesity, or the environment diabetogenic environment. So I believe that the input what we get from our environment is creating diabetes mainly, and then putting on fat is just a protective mechanism to save you from developing diabetes, because diabetes is the ultimate bad thing that can happen. That's the kind of the king of metabolic diseases. So if your system breaks, you are prone to developing cancer and cardiovascular disease and everything. So those that have diabetes are much more likely to get these other diseases too. So I think actually now I see adiposity as a protective mechanism, and as long as you are able to put on more and more protective fat, you can avoid diabetes. So those people that develop diabetes without getting actually fat, just with a little bit excess weight, mostly within their abdomen, within their stomach area, they are just not able to add more kind of benign fat below the waistline mostly.
Yes. And that's a great way of looking at it. You have a fat threshold. As long as you can keep expanding subcutaneous adipose tissue safely, while your insulin and glucagon and free fatty acids all stay in control, you're saving yourself from diabetic dysfunction and from the chronic diseases like heart disease and heart attacks, cancers that result. And everyone has a different threshold. Like we say, the lipodystrophy, it's really low. And then some people can become enormous and are still metabolically healthy. Yeah. So probably the worst group, as I mentioned, are the non-fat, non-obese who are ragingly diabetic inside. Personally, I feel that
a thin outside, fat inside, a TOFI.
TOFI, exactly, yeah. Or the other one is metabolically unhealthy normal weight, I think MUNW.
Yeah, but yes, kind of a medical term already.
Yeah, more the medical term. But for me, those people, something like a calcium scan in middle age, although most medical tests may not pick this up because they're not measuring insulin, they're not measuring post-meal glucose, a single quick calcium scan will identify those people who have very high heart disease. But the next step then, when you find out you have a lot of calcification in your arteries, is what do you do about it? And then we're back to what you mentioned earlier. I mean, that is the list of things to reverse diabetes, essentially.
Yeah, I think I'm pretty much online with the views of Dr. Kendrick, so that cardiovascular disease is a problem of coagulation, and there are several things that can lead to an increased proneness to coagulation. So, and one is insulin resistance, hyperinsulinemia. So this is, I think nowadays is the most common by a huge margin. And then of course you would like to reverse it. And diagnosing insulin resistance can be different from diagnosing cardiovascular disease, because if your cardiovascular disease is a bit more advanced, then of course you are perfectly right, the calcium score is the gold standard. That's what you need to do to see actually the progress of the disease. Otherwise you are just looking at surrogate markers.
Blood markers.
Yeah, blood markers, and then yeah, what you see can be promising or calming or whatever, but actually when you see your calcium score of 0 or very low, that's when you can calm down and say that, okay, I'm doing it right.
Yeah, so for someone indeed with a high score who then does all the things you said and more, if they a couple of years later maintain a similar score, they know they've stopped the progression. So again, they get a validation based on the disease itself rather than blood markers, which may improve, but you can't be so sure. Yeah. So I think then in wrapping up on this one, we know what you need to do if you have an insulin resistance problem, and we know generally what it is. Another fact is that 52% of adult Americans are now pre-diabetic or diabetic. That was published in 2016. Myself and Dr. Gerber, and I reckon yourself guess, if you did proper post-meal insulin testing, probably 60 or 65% are. So we're talking about the majority of the adult population of the US is now suffering what we are talking about, which is a huge risk factor for all chronic disease. So hopefully we can get this message out to them as to what to do about it. So thank you very much, Gabor.
Yeah, thanks, Ivan.